So how often have you heard this line of thinking? Oh, he's just a bro. He doesn't know what he's doing. He's just big because of his genetics. He's actually getting results in spite of his training. If he knew what he was doing, if he used science, if he analyzed things, if he used some brain cells, he'd be way bigger. And I've heard that line of thinking many, many, many times. And usually it's someone smaller talking about someone bigger. Nerd! And I used to be that small guy. I used to be the guy who was like, these apes, these monkeys just tossing weights around. Yeah, if only they listened to me. Well, now I kind of am that big guy, and so I'm on the receiving side of these types of comments, which I find ironic. Now the first would be partial reps. If you look at the way a lot of these guys train, they're not locking out their dumbbell presses, they're not going all the way up here. They're kind of keeping in this mid-range because they say that it keeps tension on the muscle. And, they might be right, particularly as they are often using lengthened partials. And I think this is one case where the science is sort of catching up with what a lot of athletes in the field actually do. And Ronnie, when he's doing squats, he's not going all the way up. When he's doing front squats, it's kind of like mid-range bottom partials. He's essentially keeping the movement in the most difficult part of the range of motion. And actually I heard Larry Scott, one of the 1950s, 1960s first Mr. Olympia winner, he would call these burns. So essentially, you go to failure, you're doing your biceps curls, and then you do lengthened partials after failure. And yes, this burns. And there wasn't any research on this. Back then, exercise science was barely a thing, but they were going by feel. They felt the muscle more when they did that, and perhaps they even observed more growth. If you are very attentive to details, you can see if you are building muscle. You can say, okay, I added in these partials, and it seems like my measurements are going up very, very gradually. It seems like I am growing. And the idea that you have to use a meta-analysis to see if you're making progress is pretty ridiculous. Similarly, number 2, we have regional hypertrophy.
Regional manager.
This was often said by the bros that, okay, you can work your upper chest, your lower chest. And then I heard for a while people saying, oh no, the chest contracts as a whole. The whole thing contracts. Which now we know actually you can target upper chest or lower chest or mid chest. Same thing with the traps. These fan-shaped muscles, you can target individual parts of it. Now we also know that you can target different parts of, say, the quadriceps. You can target more vastus or different parts of the quads, depending on your stance on the leg press, depending on your toe position when you're doing calf raises, that type of thing. And you can actually have different parts of the muscle grow. So not just different parts of the chest, but perhaps even the inner chest or the outer chest. And for a long time, I thought this was BS. The bros would say, cable crossovers, they work the inner chest. Flies on the bench, they work that outer part of the chest. I'd be like, these guys are idiots. There's no science behind this. Well, they were right. Now there is. Number 4 would be bro splits. Now this is one where I am still not entirely sold. I prefer a little bit higher frequency, twice or even 3 times per week. But for a while, the frequency thing was all the rage. You gotta do 3 times per week, 4, 5, 6 times per week, full body every day, etc. And it kind of got a little bit out of hand, and it was the idea that, the bros are idiots, they're training once per week, they could be so much bigger, so much better if they only, knew the science and they only, trained more frequently. And then, the data is like, actually, it was more about the volume of training, the frequency helped you do more volume, but it's actually okay to do a bro split, and in some ways it might actually have advantages. Now, again, personally, I still prefer higher frequency, but if right now, if I hear someone doing once per week frequency, I used to be like, this guy clearly has no clue. But now I'm like, yeah, totally fine. Next one, deadlifts for back thickness. Now, it's something that I heard a lot back then, and it was like, no, the deadlift is a posterior chain movement. It barely works the back. The back is just, kind of working a little bit isometrically. But I think in this case the bros were right. The deadlift, if you think about it, the deadlift often gets you sore in the back. The spinal erectors, I've had lat soreness from deadlifting, I've had trap soreness from deadlifting, But unless I'm doing an RDL where I'm pushing the hips back and really focusing on the hamstrings, my hamstrings don't really get that sore. If I'm doing a deadlift from the floor, my glutes don't get sore. They're not really being stretched. Whereas when you're doing a deadlift, all this stuff, that's what is actually being, put under load and stretched, especially when you're going heavy and you're really overloading the movement. And the bros were very well aware that stimulus to fatigue ratio was a thing. They might have phrased it like, oh, deadlifts, they tax your CNS. Maybe kind of a thing, but not super supported. But I think they were just voicing that deadlifts are more fatiguing because they work a ton of musculature through a pretty good range of motion, a lot of axial loading, etc. And so maybe the reason they gave was not perfect, but in a practical sense, them saying, oh, I only do one set of deadlifts because it's super fatiguing, they're still getting the job done. They're still making the right decisions. They're just voicing it in a way that was not exact. But at the end of the day, I would rather do the right things for the wrong reasons than the wrong things for the right reasons. Next up, the Hypertrophy Rep Range. Now, I think that you can still make gains at a variety of rep ranges, but if you had to pick one rep range, would it be only sets of 5? Probably not. Would it be only sets of 30? Probably not. Whereas 8 to 12, it works on compounds, it works on isolations. It's not so high that the limiting factor is muscular endurance or just overall endurance or your willpower when it burns. It's also not so heavy that it beats you up. And so I think 8 to 12 is really, really good on a wide variety of movements for a wide variety of people. And, doing 3 sets of 8 to 12 is a pretty good starting point for most people. Next up, cheat reps or somewhat loose form. If you look at a lot of these guys do their bent over rows or their lateral raises, there's quite a bit of swing on lateral raises. There's quite a bit of oomph on their bent over rows. They are doing what it takes to smooth out the resistance curve. They're not thinking about it necessarily, which is probably a good thing in some ways. They are just trying to make the movement roughly equally difficult because it is inherently more challenging in that top contracted position. So they want to try to get the heavier weights up to that top position and then control them on the way down. And so it's equally challenging at the beginning because you're really trying to get momentum from that bottom position to the mid-range, to the top, and then you're trying to resist it on the way down. And I would say this is overall a good decision. Maybe they wouldn't always articulate exactly why they were doing it that way. It just felt better. And of course, this would often be dismissed, again, I've been there, as ego lifting. Oh, this guy, he's trying to impress other people with his 3-plate bent over rows. He should be using a plate and a half and pausing at the top with super strict form. In all likelihood, if he did that, he would be smaller. By the way, this video is sponsored by the one and only Boostcamp. They are a fitness app where you can log your progress, you can jot everything down in there. Progression is very, very important, and you should know the weights that you used in the past. Going by feel is important, but you can't just go in and have no point of reference of where you are because you don't know where you were before. So having an app like Boostcamp can be extremely useful. Also, you have resources at your disposal. I have 2 programs up on there if you want to get started on something that is going to be very, very effective for muscle growth. I have a 3-day per week program as well as a 6-day per week program. Both of those are going to treat you right. And once again, thank you to Boostcamp for sponsoring this video. Next up, and this might be a little bit of a controversial one, but a clean diet. You look at a lot of these guys, their diet is very clean. Now, clean is kind of an ambiguous term. It's not clearly defined, but it's not like they're subsisting on cakes and cookies and all kinds of processed garbage. And there's the idea that as long as you're hitting your macros, food quality doesn't matter. And I don't think that is the case. I think that in terms of micronutrients, in terms of systemic inflammation, your food quality absolutely matters. It can be taken too far, to where it's obsessive, to where you can't eat anything that is not on a certain list of foods, and often the list is pretty short, where it's 7 foods that you can eat. I think you can have quite a bit of flexibility in your diet in terms of food choice, in terms of mealtime, etc. You don't have to eat every 3 hours. But if you are big, if you are very, very active, if you're trying to gain weight, you're trying to gain muscle, and you're training hard, I think realistically eating every 3 hours to 4 hours is probably what you will have to do at some point. So I think meal timing, for the general population, it might not matter, but once you are big, once you are strong, once you are trying to maximize the number of times during the day that you are stimulating muscle protein synthesis, you might need to eat every few hours. There's just no other way around it. For these guys, intermittent fasting probably is not the way to go. Next up, an emphasis on time under tension. Now, I've done videos kind of debunking this, and I think time under effort is probably a better way of thinking about this. Because often when I see people try to implement time under tension, they're just like, oh, well, I gotta work hard for 30 seconds, and they end up forgetting the working hard part, and as soon as 30 seconds shows up, or 45 seconds, or whatever it is, they're like, oh, guess I'm done. Well, no, you still have to be going close to failure. You still have to be working hard. You still have to put in a good effort. It's just that typically your sets will probably last 30 to 60 seconds if you are controlling the weight adequately and you're working in a reasonable rep range. Are you going to maximize hypertrophy with sets that last 10 seconds or a minute and a half? Probably not. It's either not enough time under tension, time under effort, too much loading, or not enough loading to where it's more endurance. And I've also been very dismissive of the pump. I still think that getting a pump doesn't mean that much in terms of mechanistically what is causing muscle growth, but it's not a bad sign, and it's probably a sign that you are sleeping enough, that you are eating enough, particularly carbohydrates. Sometimes enhanced lifters will up their dosages, get more of a pump, grow more, and think it's the pump, whereas it's just the dosages that are causing the pump and also causing the increased muscle growth. So I think this is sometimes where they can be conflated. But even if you're natural, I think getting a pump, at least it's showing what you are working, where you are working. If you're bench pressing and you don't feel anything in your chest and there's no blood flow there, yeah, I think maybe you could alter your technique or change the movement in order to get better results. Similarly, the mind-muscle connection. The bros would be like, oh, connect with this, feel with this, where do you feel this? Whereas the stereotypical science nerd would just read a meta-analysis or go based on EMG. I think you can maybe use that as a reference point. EMG has a lot of issues. I've referenced EMG in the past, like, here are the 10 best side-down exercises based on EMG. Whereas, I look back at that, I'm like, why did I ever think that, getting 2 extra points of EMG on a study on other people, like, how is that actually going to be any kind of a determinant of what is a good exercise? It just doesn't make any sense. Embarrassing, right? Too bad I have like 3,000 core answers and I can't go back and vet them all. But, I think the mind-muscle connection, it is going to be far more useful than EMG, that's for sure. And it also could be a way to get more out of a movement or to decide which movements are right for you. Similarly, often the bros used a variety of movements and modalities. So they might use barbells, they might use dumbbells, they might use cables, they might use bodyweight stuff as well. And if you look at a lot of the research, it might say, oh, weighted push-ups are equal to a barbell bench press. On average, maybe, but you can use them as the tools they are rather than just the results in someone else. So you might use barbells before push-ups. Would you do push-ups before a barbell bench press? Probably not. Would you do a leg extension before a squat? Maybe to warm up, but typically you'll do your bigger compounds first. So I think in terms of exercise variation and variety and exercise ordering, a lot of the times the bros nailed it. And often the bros had a focus on working hard, on progressing from the last week, on beating the logbook, and on just, in general, working hard and putting in a good amount of effort. And so that is going to be by far a bigger determinant of progress than your book knowledge. And so you have, in a lot of ways, these two groups sort of talking past each other, right? You have the guy who's in the gym, in the trenches, putting in the work, and he looks at the science nerd, he's like, this guy doesn't even look at him, he doesn't know what he's talking about. And then the science guy who's, watching this big ape-like motherfucker pound the weights, he's like, this guy, he doesn't know what he's doing. Well, I think both sides can learn from each other, and both sides kind of have to have the humility to realize that one side doesn't know everything. And so I personally have kind of gone back and forth. I've kept up with the science quite a bit. I do find it very, very interesting, fascinating even. But I've also combined it with bro science. And bro science has a bad connotation, doesn't it? Let's take that shit back, okay? Yeah, like I have a little bit of a bro scientist in me where I go in and I just like crushing the weights a little bit, and often a lot of bit. And so I think you can use both, and they do complement each other quite a lot. Anyway, if you want to know more, much more about the training side of things, you can check out my books. I will link them in a pinned comment. They will be extremely helpful on your fitness journey, and the feedback has been amazing. Thank you so much for everyone who has gotten it before, and I will see all y'all in that next video. Peace! Geoff, lift weight. Lift weight, make Geoff happy.